Okay. Okay. Hello. My name is Ioanna Piniara, and today I'm going to present my book entitled We Have Never Been Private, The Housing Project in Neoliberal Europe. The book is based on the PhD thesis I completed at the Architectural Association in London under the supervision of Pier Vittorio Aureli and Maria Giudici. It is published by Actar Publishers and supported by the Onassis Foundation. I would like to wholeheartedly thank all of the above, all the people and institutions I've mentioned, without whom this publication would not have been possible, and especially my publisher who organized this event for me, and La Capelle and the Architects Association for hosting us here today. Thank you so much. It's a beautiful occasion. I'm really happy to be here in Barcelona, the 2026 World Capital of Architecture, and of course I'm happy to be joined today by my dear friend and former colleague at the AA, Cristina Gamboa. She's a well-known architect here. I don't know if I should introduce her much more, but she works, she's a member of La Colle Architects, and she's also teaching, she's a professor at the CHUB. She will be my respondent in the discussion following a short presentation of my book. I think that's all. I've thanked everyone, and we should jump to the presentation. So the idea for this for the research of the book springs from the context of the contemporary housing crisis and the ever-increasing use of the term privatization. So the book investigates the management of domestic space through the transformation of the concept of the private within the socioeconomic regime known as neoliberalism. So the concept of being private. Here is the structure of the book, 3 chapters. The first chapter offers a genealogy of the private as a state project. So this genealogy posits the neoliberal housing project within a constitutive historicization of the private since antiquity. I argue against this idea, to which we have been domesticated for centuries, that the private is the realm of personal autonomy, contrary to the public, which is the realm of political governance. I aim to show that the private sphere has always been under control and at the service of the orderly function of the state. In order to do so, my genealogy unravels the emergence and conceptualization of the private in antiquity and its transformations in modernity. So, historically, the constitution of the private is necessitated by the emergence of the state as a form of political governance. It is dictated first by the need to protect the accumulation of wealth, that is property, and second, to regulate the cohabitation of large populations into dense urban environments, the first city-states. So the private is primarily both an institutional and a typological issue which is identified with the domestic realm. And I examine it in both ways in the book. My genealogy distinguishes the idea of the private in ancient states, in liberal states, and then in the neoliberal market state. In ancient states, the private sphere is distinct but inferior to the public sphere as the place of political freedom. The organization of ancient domesticity in Europe reveals how the private is administered as the spatial apparatus for the indication of property, the household management, and the production and reproduction of all the hierarchical relationships which are necessary to support the idea of citizenship and of the function of the city-state. So the household produces the citizen of the ancient city-state. What separates ancient from modern domesticity, according to Michael McKeown, is the categorical distinction of the private as such in the 17th century and the degree of abstraction this definition entails. The liberal ideology is linked with modernity because here we have 2 passages, the one from let's say, antiquity to modernity, but this coincides from the passage from ancient states to liberal states. And I argue that the liberal ideology is linked with modernity since it introduces a significant change in the organization of economic life and hence of the state, which is based in the absolute distinction of the private sphere and the modern meaning of privacy as a privileged social status which is identified with the exchange value of domesticity. I will not go too much into this bibliography, but I describe how in the liberal state and this notion of society around economic value also wraps domesticity around value, and specifically the value of the private. Housing typology, of course, reflects this process, starting from the bourgeois private apartment of the 18th and 19th centuries to the early 20th century working class type in the middle, and finally to the middle class type in the second half of the 20th century, the period which I frame as the neoliberal context. The middle class, I argue, is a neoliberal construct to reflect the aspiration for social upgrade through housing. Then neoliberalism as an ideology for living is the culmination of the transformation of the private from a category to an institutional process, which is privatization, which subsumes spaces and subjects under the logic of the exchange value and promotes the private both as a liberty and a commodity. So I argue that in the neoliberal era, the market has constantly partnered the state, which provides through policy and planning, a carefully designed pedagogy of domestic privacy. And this leads me to my hypothesis that the private has hardly existed as such in the neoliberal era. Sorry, let me have some water. Sorry. My second chapter deploys the study of selected housing schemes in London, Berlin, and Athens to demystify the aspirational mandate behind the neoliberal housing project. And that was being private in the heart of the city. So it's coming in a moment where housing had been expelled to the suburbs, and now it's arguing for a new desirable way of living in the heart of the city. These projects follow a neoliberal course across Europe from the anticipation of neoliberalism in post-war London. That's why I frame neoliberalism back then, from the post-war effort of states to get back on their feet, to the culmination of neoliberalism at the IPA Berlin of 1987 and the severe crisis of neoliberalism in Athens after the 2008 global mortgage crisis. This selection reflects my critique of neoliberalism not just as a policy adopted in the 80s to promote a new institutional regime, which is commonly identified with the Thatcherite policies in Britain and Reagan policies in the US, but as a broader post-war cultural project that aimed at changing the ethos and organization of housing. The Barbican Estate is the unprecedented developmental initiative of the local government, the City of London Council, in the mid-50s to use council housing in order to make the devastated inner city of London a desirable place to live again. What is striking typologically is the configuration of an exclusive version of privacy within a walled garden suburb that turns its back to the grim industrial urban reality. So if you compare the inside and the outside, they're two completely different realities. The Barbican offers a typological differentiation of over 100 flat types, but nowhere is the vision of social and economic upgrade clearer than in the tower flats, especially at the top floors. Their layouts stress a conservative nuclear family structure with the extreme individualization of rooms and the new hierarchies of the bedroom and the living room in these dramatic corners. My next case study, the International Building Exhibition, which I call IBA, in case that was not clear, of 1987 in Berlin. It had the theme, the inner city as a place for living, and it introduced globally the terms urban renewal and reconstruction that were in the program's brief as neoliberal tactics, only here they were implemented as part of a state policy for subsidized housing. The IBA invited internationally distinguished architects to participate through competitions, and we see here the winning entry by Aldo Rossi and Gianni Bragheri for Block 10. However, more open and radical typological proposals, along with a different vision of the city, like OMA's proposal we see below for the same block, these were rejected. So a certain kind of ideology in the proposals was favored. The IBA strategy to reconstruct the traditional perimeter block reanimated a historical idea of living, which effectively privatized the interiors of the blocks by turning all the living areas towards the inside, establishing a clear-cut distinction between private and public space at the block perimeter. My last case study in Athens presents another application of neoliberalism in housing, the conversion of a symbolic architectural type, the headquarters of the architectural firm of architect and planner Konstantinos Doxiadis on top, in the luxurious housing scheme One Athens designed by Diversity Architects below. The Doxiadis building was built at the end of the 1950s and realized his acoustics theory manifesto, according to which every building represents a human settlement, so a community, and is designed according to principles that enhance community bonds and ethics. And he has these principles like the atrium and the design of the rooms. However, in the conversion, the state organs that were involved in the decision-making did not prevent this intervention that was entirely contradictory to the nature of the building. We can see above the ground floor of Doxiadis building and below the conversion. The Architectural Council concluded that only the structural system was to be preserved, not any of the interior arrangements. So typologically, we see in the ground floor plan luxurious and exclusive programs that are not in any version open to the public, like in the original building. And in the floor plans, for the residencies, the design presents practices, again, of extreme individualization, especially when compared to the original layout, where spaces were equally distributed and the partitions were mobile, so spaces could be unified. My response in the epilogue is the hypothesis for a conceptual shift towards an ecology of the private, and the pilot project for the trigonal block settlement in the area of Kessariani in central Athens. It is developed on 3 levels: a juridical framework, an urban strategy, and a design manual for the typological adaptation of an existing housing complex. Conceptually, I propose a shift from the economy towards an ecology of the private. Ecology, from Greek ekos and logos, denotes reasonable or more proportional use of domesticity. And for me, is an operational principle to address privacy as the possibility of preserving personal autonomy through practices of commoning. Therefore, I'm looking at how such an initiative can be undertaken on the juridical level of local government in the city, and my case study is the Trigono block, this shaded area, which is the Trigono settlement in Kessariani, where I carried out a field study for over 2 years. The construction of the housing blocks in the settlement was part of the state housing program to accommodate a massive influx of Greek refugees, and they were designed in the 30s and built in the 50s and 60s. The ideas behind the design of the block settlements are situated within the broader context of the interwar modern movement's ideas about community and neighborhood. Oops. Sorry. The flat typologies were inspired by their exemplary counterparts in Germany and Austria, but they were adjusted to the limitations of the Athenian climate and scale and housing reality. The Greek version also prioritizes the economy and simplicity of construction due to lack of funds. Due to its unique model of tenure, which is a hybrid of state-owned land and privately owned residences, the Trigono settlement managed to resist pressing demands of privatization over the years, and not only offer affordable accommodation in the city center, but represent a dynamic and resilient contemporary mixed community. At the level of urban strategy, I am interested in how the Trigono block settlement can be part of a larger network of interventions in similar settlements in the inner city of Athens, so that they all have better chances of survival. This strategy identifies their distinct urban typologies, which I consider as islands in the Athens archipelago. My policy introduces to the Greek context the radical form of land as common heritage of a community, which is found in the institution of the Community Land Trust, the CLT. So the Trigono CLT is appointed by the municipality as the steward of this land in the name of the Trigono community. This entails a very important change of status, a shift from public to collective property, where separation and interdependency of functions is the way to preserve autonomy. So whereas all functions were collected under the state, now they are distributed to different parts of the CLT collaboration. So in order for the housing blocks to reflect the common property of land, my policy promotes the complete substitution of individual title in the long run. The pilot project for these housing blocks is an experiment of a typological transformation from within the living units, and the main types are registered here in this catalog. So these are the dominant types which imply from the outset minimum living for a nuclear family structure, except for type A, the top one, which is addressed to maximum 2 people. Is the smallest one. Interestingly, type A is one of the most popular and liveliest examples in the area. This I call the paradigmatic type. It has a linear arrangement of flats and 2 communal staircases united by an external service corridor. The bedrooms are all facing the back side, while the rest of the activities spill out on the corridor. For the longest part of the day and the year, the corridor becomes a terrace, a dining room, and a space to receive guests, a storage room, a garden, a laundry room, and basically a space for socialization and mutual care. Thus, I experiment in infusing the paradigmatic logic in the linear blocks of the settlement, starting with the largest compound of types C and D, which are 2-bed and 3-bed flats. The logic is the arrangement of equally sized private rooms towards the same side, while the living spaces become communal and more spatially generous. Phasing is a crucial aspect of this project. Therefore, I start with the most basic design scenario of 2 units merging, which were originally intended for families with 1 or 2 kids. In both flats, the original kitchen has expanded to take up the terrace space in search of more living area. So the unit operation aims to redistribute private space equally while collectivizing the rest of the services in an attempt to enhance the qualities of both. The project is essentially about the treatment of the partition walls, first in the communal spaces. The brick walls are replaced by cross-laminated timber panels. Then the same process is undertaken in the private areas. External walls are replaced by floor-to-ceiling folding windows. The private room can be assembled by 2 skilled men in 20 minutes. The private rooms can host various combinations of users and arrangements, and they can be interconnected through sliding or removable panels. Once a new unit is added to the scheme, new capacity is released, especially for communal spaces. When enough units on different floors are accumulated, then there is possibility for internal mobility. I would say it is an open-ended project with various propositional stages, but not really a final one. But any spatial configuration in the process of commoning needs to be predicated upon trust to a certain degree in order to secure privacy. And this is implied also in the Community Land Trust institution. Once egalitarian access to a new quality of being private is established, then more possibilities of living together emerge. I've designed protocols for other block types too, where commonality opens up the spatial framework of the domestic module, which is the minimum, and it opens up to the outdoors in order to compensate for the restricted capacity of indoor spaces. And finally, the most apocalyptic aspect of this project for me was that the typological calibration between privacy and collectivity in domestic spaces can release a vast potential to address other important issues linked to housing besides the economic factor, such as social isolation, loneliness, and the privatization of care. When this potential is devised through the lens of community empowerment, it can lead to a new learning of how to be private in the heart of the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ioanna, for this introduction and presentation of the book. For me, it's a huge pleasure to be here today, joining you in this presentation. As you mentioned, we met at EA many years ago, and I had the pleasure to visit the site by your hand, also to present the singularities of the place, to understand more about this sensible kind of site and understanding. And I think it's especially relevant to present the work here today, because we are in Barcelona in a context of this these global consequences of neoliberalism. And I think for me, it's as a practitioner that has been involved in the concept of domesticity, trying to be an alternative, but in a city which it's really suffering for the scarcity of housing, I think it's absolutely necessary to present those ideas, to understand how these entanglements between the private and the market, or the private realm or the market itself, the use of the private has to be redefined, but the market, the role of the different stakeholders. So for me, the book became a kind of a reference book, a book to go, where all the kind of the theoretical frameworks that you are exposing, how this construction of the notion from the privacy to the private, even from the right to the city to the right to privacy. And well, I think that precisely it's kind of the value of the book. And because also I think it's kind of discovering for me the challenges, or it's kind of challenging the limits of the academic research, in the way it is addressing a theoretical framework, but also how the design, which for me the difficulty is how we can design, how the design can manifestate, or how the manifestation of the political impacts are included in the design. And I think that precisely you have done that in the third part. And the last point, it's which are the tools that we use as architects. So for me, it's kind of an understanding of the discipline, that it's also expanding the borders itself, and gives hope in a way of the approach that as architects, with this rigorosity, this sensibility, this consciousness about the different layers of the existing realm, the existing cities. No? So for me, it's kind of a toolkit in a way. You mentioned the manual in the last part, but the book itself, I think for all architects, at least for me, it's kind of a book of reference. So I was thinking that, as you mentioned, it's a book that became with a PhD under the supervision of Pier Vittorio and Maria Giudici, and the richness of fields of research, from philosophy to economy, etc., is something really relevant. So I was thinking in which way maybe you could introduce some of these authors that has been instrumental to unfold all those notions of privacy and private.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you very much for how you appreciated the book. It means a lot to me, coming from a professional and practitioner in this specific field of. Even now, I'm not super confident on how to say it. I mean, collective housing, social housing, cooperative housing. We've come up with all those notions just to be able to say that we work with communities and not with individuals, or we'd like to address housing through that lens. So exactly because this field is again one that we as architects turn our attention to, it's been redefined at the moment, And that is why I believe it requires the agency of all these neighboring fields, or for some might not be so connected, but they are like economic theory, legislation, or even legal theory, philosophy, social studies, political studies, and I believe architecture as a discipline really needs to open up to these sciences and fields if we are to come up with solutions in these very complex problems of contemporary cities. So to begin with, to try to approach and define the context I'm operating in, which is a neoliberal context, I turn to economic theory, because first and foremost neoliberalism is an economic philosophy, but I argue that it was promoted and then established as a broader cultural project, an urban project, if I may say so. So for me, the main pillars, in order to understand what I'm dealing with, were two main authors. They were the key theorists of neoliberalism, which was theorized in the 30s, and then the war came in between, and then it was introduced as a, let's say, mode of governmentality after the war. These two key theorists were Hayek and Polanyi. So there were two key readings, The Road to Serfdom by Hayek and The Great Transformation by Polanyi. So the one, Hayek argued for the need of neoliberalism as a new philosophy, the grounds of which are very understandable for the time he wrote it, together with a group of philosophers who worked on this new scheme, because Europe was just coming out of a war, and all the perks of totalitarianism and fascism, where the state played this role of what Hayek called the great dictator. So he made a philosophy of how to move away from this great dictatorship that is state totalitarianism, and move towards other modes of planning. He really wrote about it as a planning theory as well, which is very interesting. And in my book, I explain in detail all the qualities of planning, or principles of planning that he theorized within neoliberalism. He used the terms such as differentiation, flexibility, all these ideas that meant that there's not just one authority from which planning is driven, and pluralism is invited. And on its very premises, this was understandable for the time. The only flip side, the downside, is that he was so optimistic about it, but all the theorists at the time knew the shortcomings that such a blind trust to the market and the self-regulating mechanisms of market would lead to, that they were limited, and that the state would need eventually to intervene to regulate somehow the limits of these methods and practices. So then came Polanyi. It's so interesting to me. They write in the same year, 1944, and Polanyi Polanyi's book, which I believe everyone in today's society should read to get a real understanding of the origins of our social and economic transformation. So his book is a cautionary tale. He says that the market has no innate ability to self-regulate or towards excrescence or towards self-regulation. It is driven by the values that are invested in its function. And if the values are profit, maximum profit, or the idea of exchange value, or the value of urban land, then it will drive the system towards these values. If there are no social values invested, then, so he explains so very well our current predicament of how, I mean, it's not a shock, it's not a surprise that we came to lose the social values of housing, because they were never the input. So the market does not work to accommodate them. So for me, that was these two readings, these two authors explained a lot. They explain a lot about how housing has its position within the total system, which is where I can find the reasons why it doesn't work in certain areas, and where we as architects and as practitioners or even philosophers, we can intervene to come up with a new philosophy that serves us better after the consequent crises and shortcomings.
Well, I think that it's just kind of a small piece of all these kind of collages, no? Of different kind of theories and references, that I think that precisely the richness of how you are unfolding it, it's something crucial. In following a bit with the central argument, which I think it's totally linked what you have already presented, no? How it's kind of this construction of the domestic realm, and how it's linked this idea we have never been private. I wanted you, if you can, throughout the genealogy that you have already presented, what are the key notions or qualities that were invested in the private to serve this dualism or distinction between the private and the public, that actually it's tied or deeper to the state control?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This is an interesting point to stress that how privacy as a social value, as an existential value almost, which is really necessary for human survival, was removed in this process of abstraction that I talked about from the private as a category. So it was a bit set aside, and the private and the public became these two categories, very much like all the other dualities that modernity came up with. Modernity itself is part of a duality against antiquity. So in this abstraction, the private became the term, as I said, to denote both institutionally and spatially a realm, which came up to be domesticity. And I would say that in the passage to modernity, where this distinction became very sharp and absolute, the main value that was invested in it, that made it become so successful and popular, was the value of freedom. As I hope, I mean, my presentation was very short, and I hope you managed to realize how the transition was from antiquity, where the freedom was placed in the political realm, so in the public realm. So even the citizen was free by his, let's say, function in the public realm, and everyone in the private realm was actually deprived. That is the original meaning of privacy, like being deprived of any political rights. So then the passage to modernity flipped that key aspect where freedom and then privilege that came with it was positioned in the private realm. Of course, it denoted the social status, which was the bourgeois at the time. So privacy came to mean the luxury to withdraw from the social realm or from the fuzz of the city. And it was a privilege to be able to withdraw, to have one's own private room where he can exercise anything. It was decorated according to the personal taste. It was a place where one could express their artistic, intellectual, whatever aspects that they did not in public. And only few, of course, a certain part of society had access to it. And then, as the centuries progressed, it became a new freedom that was given to the dominant class that the system, the state wanted to or needed to develop or give the attention to. Like in the early 20th century, that was the working class with the industrialization. So that's why the private became so accessible to the working types with a minimum flats. And then in what I define as the neoliberal context, it was the middle class. The middle class, I argue, is the construct of neoliberalism in order to promote the new, again, notion of the private, this privilege of being able to have all this luxury and exclusivity in the city center in a way that excludes all others from these particular qualities.
I think in that sense that I wanted to shift from the first chapter to the second chapter, and I think that precisely you did now this link because I think that I wanted to ask a bit about how the ideas of neoliberalism as a planning philosophy caused this transformation of the private, which made housing a field of social and economical antagonism. But I think that precisely this was something that you were now like kind of pointing. So in that sense, maybe it's interesting in this idea of this kind of post-war cultural project that changed the relationship with domesticity, if you could expand a bit on how the selection of the case studies that you mentioned, from London to Berlin or Athens, address these relationships in terms of policy and typology. And I think precisely the typology is something that is also really important through the book, that you have already mentioned, but I think that maybe it's interesting to a point how these new relationships, how the typology, and also probably how specific architectural features of the housing configuration are linked to those processes.
Yes, thank you for that, because the selection of case studies, which is natural, many times sparks curiosity of why this and not so many others, because okay, my context, my geographical context is Europe. So actually what I meant was not so much a comparative study, because for this you can select anything. My case studies, my selection was more to portray a neoliberal course, like to be representative of what I defined, how I defined the context in which I operate. And so all of these projects were, first of all, emblematic, very iconic. They were very important projects and they were all realized in a critical moment in time where these cities, London, Berlin, and Athens, were called upon the duty to come up with a solution or with a proposal for housing within a problematic context. And unfortunately, that's why I use them in order to articulate my own critique. Unfortunately, they all reverted to conservative models of domesticity, even though it seemed as if there was a breakthrough, and actually there was an intention for radicality, for radical new types of the domesticity to be implemented. The cities did not take that risk that might not lead to financial return. So this for me portray at the same time all of the potential with which the neoliberal philosophy started, and then all the problems that arose throughout. And as for the policy, so the policy somehow is described already. There were state organs, basically at the level of local government, which came up with a very preset ideas of their vision of the city, and then they came up with this very well-defined and well-articulated but strict and limited briefs for these projects. So there was never much room for invention, for experimentation, but they were also very well thought and perceived and described by all the practitioners that were invited to contribute to that. The Barbican, the IBA in Berlin, and also the one in Athens project were devised by many types of practitioners, even by politicians, because there was a lot at stake in terms of their urban vision they wanted to introduce to the city. And towards the image of the city globally, towards the outside. We shouldn't forget that neoliberalism is the time where of globalization, where cities need to invite revenues and incomes from from around the world, and investments as well. And typologically, the common aspect in all the projects is a very strong urban gesture, also a bit conservative, to which they all resorted to, which is the enclosure, and is very strong in all three projects. It was called in different ways. In London, it was called the precinct, like a bigger chunk of land, not exactly larger than the urban block, which is somehow, it's enclosing a group of facilities and amenities that are linked to housing. There was much of the agenda of the vision was invested in how to frame, to enrich the use of housing at the Barbican with cultural aspects, with urban development aspects, even with retail and other stuff. There it was called the precinct, and they theorized it also as a green suburb in the city. So this is very telling of how the image of this very enclosed space was radically different from the surroundings. At the IBA, as I described, it was again very outspoken directive of the brief, of the people, the architects behind the brief, and of the Senate, of the City Council, that the intention was to reconstruct the 19th century Berlin, and therefore the traditional perimeter block. Therefore, many types of, against the so-called pluralism, they invited world-class architects to submit proposals for these competitions, and then from all these well-known architects, they only received and commissioned proposals that closely stick to the agenda of reconstructing the perimeter of the urban blocks and not introducing different visions for the city. And then in Athens as well, what was the original Doxiadis typology? It was an enclosure. It had an internal atrium. Nevertheless, it was open to the public and open to the ground floor was mainly used for public activities, social, academic activities. He invited he host conferences, all of the Doxiadis firm activities. But then in the conversion to the luxurious housing scheme, everything became forcibly enclosed, even with security, and it was not even to be used collectively by the tenants. So yes, this enclosure, which is both at the same time an urban gesture and an architectural gesture, is very much present in all the case studies.
And I think that following this idea of a certain kind of conservative approach, especially in the modes of living that were proposed in that sense, I think it's interesting that across your research there is a strong feminist and commons-oriented reading of domesticity. And passing to the third part of the book, which it's really aspiring, I think that you are proposing this idea of an ecology of the private. Maybe I would like you to to expand on how to see how the gender, the reproductive labor, the distribution of care reshapes the meaning of privacy, and how special arrangements that challenge the nuclear family and the home ownership are proposed.
Thank you. So I'm very happy about this particular aspect of the project, and if it is received in that way, as a strong feminist aspect, because throughout the field work I carried out at the Kesariani settlement, I'm sorry, the dominant part of the population that I collaborated with and welcomed me, it was a female population. And so I'm eternally grateful to them. They opened up their homes for me to document them, to document their patterns of life, the history of the block, which is very rich, the values of a group working as a community. These people actually brought these memories and practices from their places of origin, and they found a way to recuperate them in very hostile conditions, and even develop new modes of a very lively community in the new premises that were designed by the Greek state. Although this housing scheme by the state was based partly on home ownership, which in the long run actually protected the settlement against threats of privatization by the state or private investors. I saw in that the possibility of leveraging the spirit, the community, the patterns of living, and moving some steps forward to promote like a 21st century model where ownership is not necessary, home ownership, to create security. Previously that we talked about some values that were invested in the private to make it become so sought after and successful. I talked about freedom. Another key value that was invested in the private was security. And that was particularly invested in the dream of home ownership, the ultimate dream of one's own house, a private house. And this is a key aspect I want to tap into and argue for a new version of privacy and the private, where ownership has nothing to do, because neoliberalism unfolded in a way that proved exactly and consecutively how this dream collapsed, and this security was actually very precarious. So I believe there's always this room when working with communities, and I believe myself to be privileged to be able to work with one, that their experience is stronger than the state's vision for how these people should live. And so learning from these people and such long-lasting communities, because they live there since the 50s and the 60s, I think, or I try to propose a way to address domesticity, and not only away from protocols of ownership, but also protocols of governance. I try to set up a manual of how these communities can be self-managed, self-governed, although with the collaboration with the local government. Unfortunately, experience shows in all the experiments of the 21st century, or the ones I've studied, that scale is a crucial aspect when designing these projects, which means that the state cannot really go in that depth, and in this depth with every community. So when housing is provided at the level of the state, is unfortunately most of the time standardized and cannot attend to the specific needs and mixtures of people. So these are the crucial aspects for me. New types of tenure, new types of governmentality, and the architecture is never new. The architecture is tested, I believe, also in traditional wisdom in some cases. But yes, the main key is to literally and figuratively break down the boundary of the private, this barrier, and redefine it architecturally. Other than that, the architecture is not really new. It's just taking, trying to make the most out of what this community brings under its governance, which is a part of land and some blocks, some building blocks. And with this material, I think we can come up with models.
I think we don't have much time, but
it's okay. I think we have time for one last question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and despite you consider that architecture maybe it's something that goes after this kind of framework, at the same time, I think that the proposals are absolutely radical in the sense that it's proposing a way of living, what is interesting for me is that you are proposing an architecture, but also methodology of construction, but also even understanding how the time would be one ingredient, one part of the process. And for me, it's precisely this idea that you are kind of expanding the tools, but also kind of the limits of the discipline, and also how all this project, which became really real in the way that you explain it, understanding even the cost, where the materials come from, the time of building one. So there is kind of an intimate and precise and really sensible care of the details. And I also think that precisely all this caring of the process, it's also part of this feminist approach, which it's part of it.
Thank you very much. It was very much suggested to me by the tenants, by these ladies. They were the most open-minded, creative thinking people I've met, and they were not educated. They did not have any backgrounds in architecture, but they have this built-in lived experience in communities, and they showed me how things can work and how architecture can be transformed in order to offer platforms for mutual care, for commonality, for a collective way to address, as I said in the last part of my presentation, issues that are linked, are very central to everyday living and therefore to housing, that are besides the economic one, because we stick too much to the issue, which is to the issue of affordability and accessibility, and they're major issues, especially in the city centers where the pressures are unimaginable. But there are problems brought on by life itself: loneliness, lack of care, isolation. And because a great part of this population is elderly by now, they made me conscious and caring of all these aspects. I could not turn a blind eye to these realities I witnessed.
Yeah, and I think precisely from my point of view, this is kind of the value of the book, no? These readings from economical or philosophical level to understanding the needs of the existing neighborhoods, the existing people, no? And how you are addressing this kind of trans-scalar approach. Mm-hmm. So just congratulate you.
Thank you so much, Cristina. Thank you for your questions and your observations and your comments. They're really valuable to me. And I don't know, is there any comment or question or anything I can clear up? Or
no, I would love to comment, but
yes, thank you. So
yes.
feel free.
Thank you so much, both of you, for the presentation and the discussion. I mean, of course, I'm quite well acquainted with the book as part of the publisher. But I thought that this conversation really highlighted other aspects also that I really appreciated hearing. And especially, I mean, this is not a question, it's more a comment, especially diluting a bit the dichotomies between private and public and understanding it as words and realms and spaces of projection of ideals, no, and values. And how looking at what society, as you explained also in your book and in the presentation, associated with these terms, how then also this reflected a different, let's say, materialization in architecture and urban space. But I found it also very interesting to think about the public as something that is also that we need to question, no? How much is the public, let's say, representative of a democracy, of the wide public? No, who is the public and who is invited to this public? And I think the projects or your case studies that you analyze show that very well, that in a private space that is designed as a gated community, the public still exists, but it is being very selective in who's part of this public. It's being very selective of who can participate in let's say, political and public discourse. So I think as architects and designers, we have a and urban planners, we have a responsibility of materializing these ideals and being very critical and questioning about what kind of idea of public we are actually producing and what kind of idea of private. So that's just my comment, and thank you for your work and also for this discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the collaboration in the last months.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation and the discussion we've had. Maybe I would be a bit out of this conversation, like I would like to jump something more of a technicality, let's say, considering the third part of your book. And what is the legal framework in Greece, from Greece, and I don't know this framework, about the CLT? And what points we can push in order to open more these types of inhabitants in Greece especially, but in general, I'm not sure Cristina can help us through, because if I understood correct, please correct me if I'm wrong, through the process of Laborda, you were always like all inventing things and applying new frameworks during the whole process of developing and construction this project.
No, that's a very valid question. We actually had this discussion about different models of governance. The Greek legal framework is so poor and so outdated that I don't even know if at some point it was a good thing that it doesn't really provide for anything. So in a way it leaves room for anyone to come up with ideas of housing provision. It was such a bad state. So as I said, very poor and very outdated. So I had to come up with my personal study of legal framework. I didn't collaborate closely with an expert in that field. But I studied a lot of models and how the CLT has worked in other countries and cities. The main challenge is because the property status of the land, because the land is state-owned, which means it's in the portfolio of a Greek ministry, and then the legal framework only provides of a transfer of land to a municipality, not to any other legal person. So I had, first of all, what is legal person? That is another challenge. Usually in legislation, legal persons are either natural persons, so individuals, or legal bodies such as companies, but very well-defined types of bodies, like companies, enterprises, whatever their type is. But what I introduced is a non-profit organization. So first of all, it needs to be introduced as a legal person in the legislation, so that then it can have land holdings and property under its own institution. And after this is fixed in legislation, then the municipality can, if not transfer, like donate the land, then just concede the land for the use and the management of the community, of the organization which acts in the name of the community. Also in London, they came up with the term steward, is like the one who takes care after the land. And I suppose that in this case, the state would be willing to do that because this large part of land in a very central spot in Athens requires a lot of care and maintenance, which the state does not have the funds to do. So all the responsibilities for this part of land are transferred to this organization, which I come up with a scheme of funds that come from tax by the help of the municipality, or by donations, or by combination of things to be plowed back to the community or to the organization as a way to support the maintenance and everything on the land. But then at the same time, the CLT organization, the institution, actually needs to take care of the buildings as well. To be able to do that, it might also, the schemes I studied abroad, introduce some small-scale retail and entertainment activities to take advantage of this land and open up to the city. This is part of my urban strategy. If several CLTs are created and they form a network, then they should also invite the city, part of the city, in activities on this land, because the land is still public in a way, or the right type of public. And so there is some revenue from small-scale activities organized, or there can be introduced some activities that help the tenants deal with financial sustainability, like cultivations, like urban gardens, or things like that. That's why I said the new role of the architect is the one of a coordinator in a team, or like the one who describes the vision, and then many experts need to join architects in these community projects. Legal experts, sociologists, politicians, or representatives of the local authority, economists, many types of experts too, because this is a whole new reality that is introduced there.
I have the feeling that few times there is academic and theoretical research that has really, or can have a social return, and I think that precisely all these kind of ecosystem and frameworks that Ioanna has researched, but based on the pre-existing legal frameworks, economical tools, has an immense value for communities that can have all this knowledge in order to expand it, no? And to implement it. And I think that, when I'm just reading it, it's so valid and realistic, and also based on experiences all over Europe and over the world, that makes really easy that this can arrive to happen, no? And
or at least push the boundaries of existing reality. And if we gather too many people representing too many fields, maybe we find authorities who will respond. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a great pleasure for me to be here today. Thank you so much.